Okay.
So I don't want to miss. I'm recording this for the YouTube thing. Okay, we're started.
All right. Well, glad to see everybody. And today we're talking about David Kirby's More Than This. So I guess I'm leading. I'm leading this. I'm leading us off a cliff. What else could we do with David Kirby except go off a cliff? I thought I would begin. I mean, I actually have a few little passages of things that we might bed down in, if that's the correct word. But I thought I'd begin by asking, what characteristics do you see in this work? Any kind of characteristics you can name?
So when in the Rattle, when it was in Rattle, there was a quote by him at the bottom of it that said, "A lot of my poems are braids I make of found materials."
Mm-hmm.
And I think braid is probably a great word. At first I thought, God, these are really essays, or these are really anecdotes, lineated essays or anecdotes, but it's really hard to put your finger on what his style is. Anyway, I think braids is a good word for what
Yeah, Kathleen, do you know where that is in the back of the book in the notes?
No, I have it just Xeroxed it. But it's
Okay.
in the Xerox I have it's it comes right after the poem.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, in the back of the book he says that this is the note that accompanies it on the Rattle website. A lot of my poems are braids I make of found materials. My contribution is to figure out what the different parts have in common and then unite them tonally. I thought that was, might be something to think about in terms of that word tonally. In this case, there are 3 braids. My barber told me the cowboy story, the one about the English schoolboys, was told in class by a student who'd read it somewhere. But I no longer remember where I encountered the story set in the cemetery, the one that begins and ends the poem. Oh, and this braid is drenched in the bittersweet hues of the great Jack Gilbert. I fell hard for him just before I began writing this. So yeah, I mean, I think that idea of braiding found materials, and what Sandy and I were talking before you guys came in, I always like to, when I read a poet, what is it that I can learn from this poet that I might not be doing myself? And so, the ways in which Kirby brings in quotations from what he reads, that's not a characteristic, I suppose, of my own poetry, not something I would naturally do. I don't think I would naturally braid stories together that don't associatively have some kind of connection for me, or just sort of randomly throw them together and see what happens. And I don't know that that's how he does this. Maybe one of the words yeah, go ahead.
I don't think he does that. I think they do connect. I found he uses a lot of historical things and from books and other people, and I thought what he used in a poem, it all essentially connected in some way. I couldn't always see it clearly, but I could see it in a lot of them. Thank you.
Isn't that part of what he says his job, though, is to find that connection or that unity?
Yeah, he writes a poem about that, Jeff. He calls it the whataboutness, the whataboutery.
Yeah.
He says that's his job to bring your attention to that thing, that it's a rhetorical device. And I'm looking at it. I'm looking to see, he's talking about one situation, and then that makes him think of another thing or another idea, and then that takes him to another level usually he's got about 3 things in a poem, and he ties them together in thematically or intellectually, like he's trying to say this is all the same thing on a continuum, like it's all the same suffering or it's all the same love, except in different places on the timeline, for instance, because he'll choose a historical event or a current event, something out of pop culture, some sort of literary reference, some sort of historical reference in the same poem.
That poem is on page 78 too, and one of the lines says, as the scientists say, if you know what you're doing, it isn't research. So I feel like that embodies his idea about this braiding. If you know where it's going, it might not be a poem for him, maybe.
I love his voice so much. I love how it mixes a real conversational tone or voice along with all of these flights into philosophy and history, and it's fascinating. It pulls me right in, but also a real emotional component to it. It's not just in his head, it's both in his head and in his heart, which is really, as a reader, it's important for me. So it's amazing.
He's got
Any other characteristics?
Well, he's got the vocabulary of, the bow wow and the Kit Kats, and you can tell he takes things from his students, like the reflection and the refraction.
Mhm.
And he turns just the everyday into he's saying the everyday is the poem.
Mm-hmm.
So he does that with his language and with his lines.
Yeah, you think you're reading along something really entertaining, and then he hits you with something so deep. I really like what he does.
Right.
That poem about the chocolate, he turns the reader into the you.
Yes.
You are the one taking the piece of chocolate at the end. He sneaks that in I've read that poem several times, and I forget that I am the you until I get to that last line, and that you take the chocolate at the end.
Mm-hmm.
He sneaks that you in, imagine you are this person, earlier in the poem, and then it just hits me at the end, like, yeah, you're along with him. You're the reader and you're the student, and
he breaks that fourth wall by doing that,
Yeah.
which, like what you do on stage sometimes, and it's an interesting technique. And it makes you a part of it,
Yeah, at first, when I first started reading, I thought he's being facetious and a bit flippant, and like some of the others, I didn't know what to make of him at first. But then I thought and a little bit of the hostility. I thought, well, that's why I need to read him closer and deeper. It's when you go, next one,
Yeah. And Beth, I did the exact same thing. Like I read the first couple of poems and I was like, oh, I like this. And then I was like, it's all, it's more and more and more. Like, I really don't like this. And then when I kind of opened up to it and kept reading, I began to think there's a genius in this, that there's no way in the world I can write a poem like this. Like, I don't see these things, these connections that he sees. But when I see someone else do it, I think it opens up potential to, I don't know, be more aware of how a poem can work in a way you've never thought of before, which I think is the brilliance really in his writing.
Sort of an interesting self-prompt to say, with a braid, you have 3 pieces of hair and 3 pieces, and to give yourself 3 events. Think of 3 events, or something you read, something you saw, something you did, and braid it all together, just as an exercise would be tough. But
you're talking about a Seinfeld episode.
About nothing.
Last time when we were talking to Shara about maps of injury, and she was saying that she couldn't really put together metaphors anymore, but what she would do would be look for things that had the same feeling. And then she'd put those together. And in a lot of ways, I think that's what he's doing. He's just pulling across the gamut of personal experience, history, and text with which he's familiar, but he's putting them together in braid, if you will. I thought of mosaics or folds that came back. But it's what he does is pair things that give you the same kind of feeling, or amplify it, or move it just slightly one way or another. It did really remind me of what Shara was talking about. I was trying to hold up my copy of the Paris Review that just came in, because he's got a poem in it.
Oh.
Which is My Girlfriend Killed James Brown. It's funny, but it does draw interesting connections between what's accidental and what you can claim. Anyway, I'll quit.
Alice, when you were talking, it reminds me of, I was thinking of the early poems of Richard Jackson, and y'all may not be familiar with Richard Jackson's work, but Worlds Apart, which came out in the late 80s, and Alive All Day, Cleveland State, probably early 90s. And that's around the time I was in graduate school, and I remember reading Richard Jackson's poems, and that was how I described them. Like, he might start off in one direction with a narrative, and then something would come out of nowhere. I called it juxtaposition, as opposed to braiding, or as David Kirby is saying. But here's this one narrative, and here's this next thing that comes along that doesn't at first seem to have anything to do with the thing I was just reading. What the heck? And then something else would come into it, or a fourth thing. And I think what happens, and Sandy and I were talking about this before the meeting, that when disparate things are tossed together, they might not inherently have any relationship, but we have these minds, right? We have this mind that cannot deal with a kind of incongruity. So we have to find some overarching or thread or something there that finds a it's like Rudolf Arnheim, this guy said years ago in an interview, he said, "You are not free to ignore the relation." Well, sometimes we look at things and we're like, I don't see a relation. I don't see how they related. Oh, okay. And one thing, it's like, it's almost as though one story becomes, it's vehicle and tenor, and one thing is understood through the lens of the other thing. And we typically do that on a sort of micro level with, this is like that or whatever. What if you have bigger information than an image? You have a story, you have a quote, you have some historical reference, but each of those things becomes a way to understand the other one. So anyway, help me out.
Yeah, he says all art is the blues. So he gives all those different examples, from Johnny Cash to Dante. And then he has that silly little example of there's a kitty in the room and then there's a tiger.
But how do you think he starts writing these poems, though? I think he probably has a main idea, right? He's going somewhere with it. And then because he has some kind of uncanny brain, like, I don't understand this man's brain, and has so many references, and he must remember everything, right? So he remembers all these conversations, these quotes, this Bible, Shakespeare, philosophers. And then I'm almost thinking that he's starting on something, and he opens his brain to the universe, and things just kind of, I remember this. I'm going to put that in a poem. Oh, I remember what the philosopher said about this, that kind of fits. I mean, I just can't, unless it's, I don't think he's like taking 3 random things. I'm going to blend this into a poem. That seems too contrived.
I think maybe he has a lot of Post-it notes where he has written down things when he's reading something, and he collects them and he looks at them and he says, oh yeah, that connects. I think that's the way I see it.
I must need to take a much better look through my Post-it notes if that's the way to do it.
Yeah, mine are so boring.
Yeah.
Get coffee.
Oh, nothing's ever boring.
Now, I'm a little disappointed, Jeff, that you didn't start this one out with, what do you make of the cover? Because I've been waiting.
I love that
waiting
cover.
for somebody to talk to me about this cover.
I'm so baffled by that cover.
Right? That's him. That's the
But what's
photo.
he doing?
I felt like it was.
I think he wanted us to see his good legs.
He does have good legs. If this is not airbrushed, I'm telling you.
Well, my first thought was that it was a bit arty and pretentious, but once I read the work, I thought I got the sense what it was trying to show us or tell us, or something I feel more than it's anything I could put into words.
This figure, whoever it is being like carried into the wind somehow, or he's fighting with the wind somehow.
It seemed to me that what he's saying is that, well, as I said, it's hard for me to put this into words. I just sort of feel it. But more than this, that life is a deep thing, and we either need to get rid of stuff or get more wrapped up in stuff one way or another to get at it. Which sounds kind of stupid when I say it, but that was the way I felt about the cover after I read the book, was that it's the layering that we're either needing to put on or take off to find the true meaning of life, which is more than whatever we think it is that we need to put on or take off.
That's better than I could have done. Is he putting on his shirt? Is he taking off his shirt?
We don't know.
I don't even think that's a shirt.
It looks,
Yeah,
it
it's more
looks
like a rag.
like a blanket wrap.
Yeah.
A cape or something.
It kind of looked. My first thought was it was sort of like the wind had blown him this way, but how is the other part of it going in the other direction? So
Good point.
And that seems,
it's a very modern art dance move look that he's got going, and that's why when we're looking at all the songs like the Shangri-Las and Elvis, I'm like, this looks more like classical ballet modern dance kind of cover. And so I would
reason, some associative thing. It made me think of that winged, that statue with the wings out to the side. But yeah, I think it's odd to put yourself on the cover. I don't know. It's like making yourself mythic. He's trying to make, be mythic about it.
But we're seeing more and more poets put themselves on the cover, though. That's like.
This is an older book, Templegate, called Beautiful.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, how did he even get LSU to do that? LSU is they don't give you a lot of cover leeway, or maybe they give him a lot of cover leeway.
That's LSU.
Yeah.
I'm like Sandy, though. I've noticed a lot more. I mean, the very first one that we did, was it Natalie Diaz who had herself? And I was like, because you could see her breasts, and I thought, wow, that's, and here we've got David Kirby in, down to his skin too. And so it's not only are we seeing the poet, we're seeing the poet.
That's him. I mean, it may not be him, but
it looks like him. His hair looks like him.
I think it's him.
Oh, by the way, just a quick aside here. In 2 days, the National Book Award will be announced, right? So I'm assuming that Natalie Diaz is going to win. Maybe we'll find that. We'll notify you in the group.
She's our girl. She wins.
You know, if you want to say more about the cover, that's great. I was gonna. There's a poem on page 72 called "King of Goodfellows," and you know the thing about these poems though is that they're so rich in terms of like how do I distinguish and remember a specific poem, because it's like this deluge of moments and information and things that stand out. So how do you distinguish an individual poem? But within this poem, if you look on page 73, the third stanza, or the third real stanza on there, when he talks about, he says, "And all told by a sorcerer to his apprentice, because Shakespeare is so generous, so kind to us, his audience, so possessed of a mind that makes no distinction between anything and anything else. Be that thing literary, philosophical, musical, military, historical, gastronomic, genealogical, geographic, or jurisprudential. And by offering us such rings, toys, conceits, knacks, trifles, nosegays, Kit Kat bars, and other messengers of strong prevailment as these, does he invite you and me to play a game, really, an elaborate game that's totally realistic and at the same time make-believe, like a dream." I mean, you see how I can keep going on, but that idea that maybe like Shakespeare, the mind of the poet that we have here, the voice of this particular poet, is one that makes no distinction between anything and anything else. Everything, it's all available, all those different areas. And so that was one of the little passages that as there were many, right? There were many passages in this that kind of almost have a meta feel. Like, okay, this explains what this whole thing is about right here, this moment. And then you read the next page or 3 pages over and there's another one. But this one was one that really stood out to me.
Well, he also says right in this one, don't limit yourself, poets.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, no, that's exactly. And I thought, I think, wow, and he hasn't limited himself. And I think now that I'm looking at the poems again and after discussing the cover, it's almost like he's stripped down to his essential self, and you can put on whatever covering you want. You can take on whichever poetic feel you want. Like the actors, like the singers, like all arts, you have to kind of dispossess yourself of self and take on lots of other things. And that might be what he's trying to do with the cover.
Yeah, at first I was thinking he takes it too far. He's piling too much in. But in a poem like that, he's telling us why he does it. Because, my teacher self looks at a poem and says, okay, you look at is the ending working? Maybe you should kill that last stanza. You work your way from the bottom up, like, where could that poem end earlier? Or which of the stanzas are the most salvageable, for a student? Like, can you build your poem out of those salvageable stanzas? And so I look at a poem like that, man, that poem just keeps going and going and going. But that's what he's saying. Well, you just throw it all out there. You don't limit yourself. And I thought, well, at least he's being honest with himself, that's what he does. Because I would, my first impulse is to start knocking things out. Like, can you not wrap that up a little bit sooner?
Well, that was one of the things we talked about, I think, in the first meeting. And one of the things I said was I'm not a real keen fan of long poems. Because and so when we started this, I was like, wait, and I started looking at more of them. I went, what have they done to me here on this one? But I really, and somebody mentioned it at the beginning of this meeting, I started reading and I was like, okay, I really want to discuss this with people who are intelligent poetry people. So I'm going to have to sit down and read these. And I just found myself, at first turned off because of the length. But then they they grew on me. It was completely immersive. There were a few poems that didn't resonate with me, but that's going to be true for everything. But a lot of his were really just, I kept going and thinking, at first my teacher self did that too. I'm like, okay, you can lose those last two stanzas. You could have ended it here. But because he doesn't, there's a whole nother level to look at, I guess.
Mm-hmm. In the very first poem, in the first stanza, it says, I like short poems, don't you?
I know.
Hey, man.
He's playing with
It
it.
threw me off. And that was his one short poem, I think. It was only a page and a little bit.
Well, that was one of my characteristics for him is humor. And he is one of the only poets who makes me laugh out loud, or if you prefer, LOL'd. No. But he does. He makes me laugh out loud. And the Templegate called Beautiful, that particular book, I read years ago, waiting on car tires. And so I'm sitting in a waiting room with other people, and I'm reading this book. And I laughed out loud in the presence of a whole room full of people. They're all looking at me oddly, but I'm reading a book of poetry and I'm laughing. He does this with these little asides occasionally that he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on them sometimes, but he'll throw something in and it's like, what the heck? But like you're talking about, I like short poems, don't you? But there's this awareness of the artifice of a poem. And on page 90, he says, he's already on the third page of If You Were John Raleigh. And then he says, this poem's almost over. And you've come this far, so you've already bought in the way people do when they start reading something and follow it all the way through to its conclusion. While most of us postmodern, that moment makes me laugh too. Because who does that? That's just a fun. Shouldn't poems also be fun?
And then I'm going to stomp your guts out.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love that poem.
Yeah.
All the way through, he makes those comments where he's telling us, words ought to be a little wild, for they're the assaults of thoughts of the unthinking. You writers make these little buildings of mud and diamonds that most readers will never even notice. Interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon the world. Something is itself, and then it becomes another thing. So in a lot of his poems, he's telling us about the braiding that he's doing. We think it's going to be one thing, and then, oh, well, hello, it's something else. And
yeah, KB, where's that? Because that was one thing I remembered, but I didn't mark it at the time. What page is that one thing?
Which one?
One thing becomes another.
That's on page 26 in the Things I Can't Tell You.
Right. Okay.
The fifth stanza, the fifth couplet.
Right. Yeah, that was funny too. Over here, Seamus. Over here. I'm so scared. You can bite me. I'm ready. Over here. Oh gosh, I love poems.
Well, technically speaking, it's hard to get humor right in a poem. It's hard to be funny in an email. People misread tone. Everybody misreads tone. So it's incredibly difficult to be funny and profound in a poem.
Yeah.
But he does it incredibly well. At first I thought he was being facetious and flippant, but it masks that gravitas, to use a $5 word, that he has, because he can close and really clinch you, and get you. There were a few times when I had to get up and go get a tissue, because like, oh, that poem really grabs you. And he can,
Well, like the Mary Weiss of the Shangri-Las explains it all to you on page 105. That's the one that has the reflection and refraction, which is just also fascinating in the sense that the way those two words work, and even maybe the two at least two ways to think about the word reflection. But yeah, a student I haven't seen for months stops by to say hello, and she's wearing a sundress. And when she gets up to leave, I see she has a tattoo on her shoulder. So I say, hold on a sec. I mean, just using the word sec. Let me take a look. And when I see it says poetry is not reflection, it's refraction, I say, I like that. And she says, you should. You said that in the first class I took from you. It's times like this I impress myself. I laughed out loud. And then the very next thing is like, not for long though. Oh yeah. Okay. That's so true of all of us.
I had a Billy Collins moment when I read that. I was like, oh, that was just so like very reminiscent of Billy Collins.
Yeah, like if you give Billy Collins some crack or something.
just
Billy
the
Collins on crack?
Ironic humor.
Yeah.
You know who else does that is Steve Cowett. You know him?
Yeah.
I know the name. It's is it K-O-W?
IT.
K-O-W-I-T. Yeah.
And Joseph Mills, who I just met recently. He has that same, and he doesn't do this braiding thing, but there's a little bit of this fun infused, but with deeper meaning underneath that you kind of keep reading to get to. But the way that Kirby writes reminded me of both of those two poets.
I had told Sandy that one of my, actually this afternoon I was reading My Lousy Saint, which that poem is just funny as all get out. But why do so many saints sound like mafioso? Mafiosi. So I laughed out loud at that one. And like he gets this, like he wants a cool saint name or whatever on his birthday, but his turns out to be this one that's like, I can't even pronounce it myself. I mean, that's got to be a little self-deprecating, I think, when I read a poem like that.
Yeah, I don't pick up on arrogance in any of his poems. I don't feel that at all.
I think, at least for me, it's because he seems to be having so much fun.
Yeah.
And if there is, you know, to me, the sort of a major characteristic of his poetry would be that it is associative. One thing begins. I mean, you know, it can begin like you just said, Beth. That you know, it's hard to pick up on tone in an email, or it's hard to be funny in an email. Well, that's the opening line of a poem. Of course it is. Now, where does it go?
Hey, Beth, that's your assignment to write that.
Okay.
Poem.
All right.
I've already stole it. I called dibs. I called dibs.
He does write it.
The next open mic, we all have the same opening line. What, I heard that before?
Oh, there's another. All the poets have the same opening line. Let me write that one down. We're all going to be funny from now on.
I can only wish.
I'm not kidding. I'm writing this down.
That's good. Sandy's recording it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I forgot.
You know, I really appreciate the line in the poem Satisfaction. It starts on 69, but the line I really like is on page 70. It says, no matter how much in love you are at 20, there's a whole new definition of love that awaits you at 65. And if you knew what it was when you were 20, you'd spend your life being impatient. It's like, oh my gosh.
But he throws that away. He credits a newspaper for that, right? He says he just read that somewhere. Like that's a piece of prose, but he's giving it the weight of poetry.
Right.
right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows whether he read that in the New York Times? He could be. He could be making this up, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't remember where he read it.
Or
But
or
yeah, it's a
or that could
fabulous.
be the artifice of making. I mean, so many of us are poets. That's not beyond us. I mean, we would make that crap up, and
Mhm.
so I just assumed it was made up, but I could be wrong.
I like the way he turns it from who wouldn't believe the times to time does make you see things differently.
And there are lots of places like that, Alice, where as he finishes one thing, a word or an image or something there is what gives him the leap out into the next development, like another whole development of a poem.
And he does it in the exact same line. I was looking at how he does that. He'll say that he'll repeat a word from that idea in the same line, and then will jam into the next line or stanza, so that he can continue that idea.
Some of his enjambments were also pretty baffling to me, as were the reasons why he steps his lines. I can't tell why he steps his lines when he does and doesn't when he doesn't.
Well, I had a hard time because I was reading it on the Kindle. You know, Kindle is notorious for the line breaks.
Catherine, I had that same question. I was trying to figure out, you know, are we just doing this to make it not look like microfiction, you know, or something? I wondered.
Apparently that is his personal style of writing poems because it's in all of his books. Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, most of the books that I have, his earliest, I think his first book was Saving Young Men of Vienna, the Brittingham Prize in '87. And these are poems that look like this on the page. I mean, it's totally different style. And even, this is kind of an early one, Big Leg Music. I don't have all of mine in front of me, quite frankly. There must be some of them on the other bookcase. But he kind of finds his way into, as I think a lot of people do, they find their way into a shape or a form that, they can hit that note. They can hit this every time. But I did see, and I was talking to Sandy earlier about this also, that he does have a few couplet poems and shorter poems in this collection, which I was not anticipating or I don't think I had seen any of them in magazines or journals. I must have overlooked those. So I was kind of surprised by those. I thought they were a nice break, like, the poem we just mentioned, which mentions the times. Some of those poems that take that shape of couplets are really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I like the couplets pretty well, although they are long couplets. You can see them but he's kind of stretched across the page. But then the one prior is Frida Loves Diego, and he starts out stepped and then he backs out. Well, right. It's just awful. But you can see it on your page. He steps in and then he steps out, but then you go back one prior. We Three Kings, now he's stepped out, and then he steps in and then he steps out, and then by golly, line 4, another 5-7 spaces back towards the margin. I agree with the first student more than the second. Why? And I don't know why.
I can't
believe he's got a reason, but I don't know what it is.
Maybe he's braiding on the page itself, with the lines. They're like coming like this, like you would actually braid.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, those things to me are really subjective. Take a poet like Donald Platt. I don't know if y'all are familiar with him, but he'll have these. I could probably grab one of the books back here, but he'll have a 3-line stanza. So that there's one long line, the middle one will be fairly short, and then the third one will be long. But the next stanza has a short, like 4 or 5 words. The middle line of that stanza will be long. Then the next one will be short, and then the next one will be long, short. So it's this interplay between these long and short lines that after your first initial, reading of something like that depends on how we're all defining what a line in a poem is. And no two poets, I think, really agree about that. But once you get into the rhythm of it, it just seems it's the interplay of these short and long.
With that one, it sounds like he's doing this kind of visual representation of terza rima for the eye. So the long in the middle is echoing the
could be, yeah,
lines in that prior stanza.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of good reasons, and I would just really love to know what the good reason is here.
And this is when also you have to know, as a poet, you have to find a good, trustworthy group of writers who is willing to let you step outside the box of what we're comfortable and familiar with too. Because, if I took some of these and said they were mine to a workshop, I could tell you, we would be doing the whole, let's chop off the last two stanzas. Why isn't everything left justified? Why are you trying, So I think it's important to find, I don't know, maybe he does all this solo, but I find it invaluable to have a group of trusted people. And I guess we just have to make sure everybody grows with the knowledge if everybody's reading poetry and finding things like this and seeing that there are different styles and they're valid. I think that's important, and I'm glad to see it. I mean, I dearly would love to know about his format too. That's exactly what I thought as I was reading through this. And then I thought, it doesn't bother me that it's like that, but I want to know why, because I would like to go to a workshop with something and be able to say, this is why I'm doing that, kind of play with it.
Yeah, I generally don't take it to a workshop, supposing I'm fortunate enough to have one, until I can tell them why. I don't always know at the beginning, but eventually it kind of behooves us to figure it out.
Yeah.
Maybe we should phone him.
Yeah, anybody got a connection? Can we call him up?
I looked to see if he was teaching classes this semester. He was not. His wife was, but
we can ask her.
I actually looked him up because I thought I might like to take a class from this guy. So.
He also writes a lot about music, and I wonder if the line that he chooses, if it has something to do with a syncopation or something that's inherent in music. I don't know, but there is a lot of music of all kinds in this book.
And he even said in the notes that the 4-part structure of this book he owes to the symphonic masters, the 4 parts of a symphony, which without the notes in the book, I would have never recognized that.
Yeah.
But I did look that up though, just to see if I could tie that in. You can kind of, if you know to look for it.
Well, I thought all the ones toward the end were his Ars Poeticas. I mean, specifically, you could tell that they were Ars Poeticas. So I wondered if there was a reason why he saved all those toward the end of the manuscript rather than putting them toward the front, which might make sense if you declare, here's why I write the way that I do. Here's what I think poetry should be doing for the world. You might want to put those in the front of the manuscript. He put them toward the back. But yeah, I would not have caught on to the 4 divisions at all. Mm-hmm. But I was just mightily impressed when I looked at the acknowledgments page that just almost every single poem in the manuscript had been published somewhere in a magazine that I had actually heard of. Yeah. And he makes fun of Poetry Magazine.
Yeah.
I mean, he's very honest about that. That is an honest poem about Poetry Magazine. Everybody likes Poetry Magazine because you want to be published in Poetry Magazine, not because it's necessarily a good magazine. I don't know. Do they publish David Kirby? That might be a jab at Poetry Magazine.
I did look to see if that poem was published in Poetry Magazine, just 'cause I thought it would be kind of cute if it was. It was not.
I think I remember William Stafford saying one time, you're not under the impression that the best poems are always in the major literary journals, are you?
Well, did anybody have a poem in this book that they labeled as their favorite? I'm curious which ones resonated.
Besides the title poem, More Than This, which was, outstanding, probably Just Beyond the Fence, a Train.
Bingo.
On page 31.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's a kicker.
Yeah.
There were parts in just about all of them that I really, really liked. But I think the one that I just enjoyed reading the most was All Art is the Blues.
I don't know if I liked it best, but I'm very struck by This Living Hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's like 5 stories woven within that, and it just reaches that kicking kind of moment at the end. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I put a star by that one. Imelda too. That was one of my favorites.
One of my favorite ones, there are lots of favorite ones, but the one in particular was Satisfaction, because he talks about the German poet Friedrich Schiller, and he is not that well known, that except for the Ode of Joy, I guess, Ode to Joy. But he is a poet that we had in school, so I just could relate really well to that particular poem because of that. And I think in other poems he goes literally around the world and, to places where I might have been, and it was just really amazing for me.
That's the one that has the, if you knew what the definition of love at 20 and 65, that's the one that came in. But I also identify in that one with it, why is it so hard for us to be happy? Why is it so hard for me to be happy?
Yeah.
I loved All Art is the Blues, and I loved King of Goodfellas, and I loved Tony Bennett sing Smile for You. But I think I like Poverty Mon Amour best of all. Because people forget about poverty. And what's really important. And it just does such a beautiful job, from Elvis's stepbrother to everything that Jackie's losing besides the husband. And then that wonderful Dante story. I tell you, this man knows his Dante. Where he meets Thomas Aquinas, who tells him about Francis of Assisi and how the saint fell in love with the woman and how they had children together. And now Dante was known for his temper, and you could imagine him barking in anger at these words. And then you find out he's married Poverty, and he says, Poverty, we forget about her, didn't we? We were too busy with the house, the car, the job. And he winds up at the very end going back to the guy who said he was Elvis's stepbrother. And he says, son, when Elvis died, how much money do you reckon he left behind? And I'm trying to guess, but before I can say anything, he says, all of it. Yeah. And it's a really good thing, I think, on what's important and what's not important. I liked it.
And then he has a poem called Love Me Tender.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the one where he and his friend in high school are visiting every church, it all shook up.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are all these Elvis references.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by, well, there are lots of individual poems, but on page 64, when he tells the story about Hitler.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this, something in one of my classes today, I actually told this story. And I said, and I remember I said, I mean, gosh, you think about it, like, essentially, what led to the Holocaust? Someone's tenderness. Whoa. I mean, I don't, is that a true story? I assume it is, but I was really struck by that moment within the book.
That's referenced in the notes section too, where the guy says that he thinks it is, but let's see. Ample doubt is cast on the story. Private Tandy acknowledged having spared German soldiers at that particular battle, but always made a point of saying he needed more information before he could confirm that one of those was Hitler. Whether or not it was Tandy who lowered his weapon, Hitler himself believed he was spared by a British soldier who had become sick of killing.
Yeah.
I had heard that story somewhere many years ago, but I don't remember where it was. And, you know, in that same poem, something I had highlighted was, says, each of us is who we are, is the person he or she is at the moment in which he or she is him or her, and not the person he or she was just before or will be just after. Yeah. And that's a great truth, I think. I was moved by that.
I read that whole little section to my wife this evening as we were, as she was fixing dinner. I think I was helping her. I assume I was. But I was reading that little section. I said, isn't it just wonderful and lovely? That whole passage right there.
Yeah.
There was something else. Oh yeah, in the poem "What to Call It," which runs from 96 through 98. But on page 98 at the top, well, actually, if I look at the very bottom of 97 to the top of 98, that's what we poets do, isn't it? Go around the poem and look for the rough parts and smooth some of them out. Sure, just as we leave others in. I'll do the same. I'll pick 4 poems that are alike enough so as to appear that they emerge from a single mind, that is, mine, yet sufficiently different that there's some variety there, some hint that the single mind which produced these poems doesn't just run in one direction, but has little side tracks, trunk lines that flow to the east and west, yet eventually return to the main road, thereby suggesting the whole is a rich and storied enterprise. And that's what these poems do, right? They all do that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm not crazy about long poems, I do love a long title, like the one I have not come here to compare notes, but to sit together in the stillness of the edge of this one. I mean, I love a long title. There's a I can't think of the poet's name. Going as far in the woods as the woods go, something like that. Anyway, I like a long title.
I appreciate that title with the ending of it. I have nothing to say to you, really. I just want to see what I'm looking at. I want so much not to listen to you after all this time, but to hear. And it's like, oh my gosh. That's just a fantastic other bookend for the title of that.
Yeah, I noticed that long title as well. Usually that's a technique you tell students when they have to write super short, like for microfiction, for instance. You want that title to do as much work as you can possibly have it to do. So you pilot, you make that sucker a metaphor, you give it, you make it expository, you do something with that title that's super creative. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what he's doing with that title. So there are some things that he does in his work that makes me think maybe he's a disenfranchised microfictionist. He's in disguise here. Maybe he's doing some hybrid work. Part essay, part fiction, part prose.
I like the titles. Many of his titles are essentially allusions to pop culture or the doors of perception. I mean, that's got to be William Blake. We Three Kings. Satisfaction. I mean, that's the title of a song. So Love Me Tender is the title of a song. So yeah, that's kind of fascinating to even think just about his titles. Ode to Ignorance. I know his wife, Barbara Hanby, has a lot of ode poems in her books. So maybe that's a little veiled echo of her. But then I love, like, the very last poem in the book, A World in Which These Things Happen, which is slightly, if I remember correctly, a slight change of a line within that poem. So anyway, that's a whole other kind of conversation or discussion as poets. How do we, it's hard enough to write the poem, and then, oh my God, you got to put a title on it too. It's just so difficult.
Little titles.
Yeah. Well, what else do you want to ask or talk about?
What was your favorite section? Did anybody have a favorite section they liked? Or was it just piecemeal for everybody?
I thought the book got stronger as it went along, but I was really thinking this is more like a greatest hits compilation. Since he's, so into music, and since all the poems have been published, and he said, I had to work on the manuscript. I thought, dude, your poems have already been all of them have been published. What are you working on? So does he revise these poems after they've been published in magazines? So I thought, well, maybe he's thinking about what order he wants them to be in. I don't know.
There's a line somewhere in one of the poems, I'm trying to find it, where he says, give it your best, always give it your best. Does anybody know where that is? Don't waste the words.
Yeah, there's an echo of that. I don't remember where.
I even know which side of the page it's on.
Always.
Yeah, it seems to me that almost any place you would look down in this book, you're going to find something that seems a great commentary on the whole, or some characteristic of the kind of voice that's created in these poems. If you were John Riley, that particular poem, I mean, I love when he, on page 88, he says, since you've come this far with me, reader, let me ask you two questions. One, is that a good story or what? Which isn't really a question. And two, is truth stranger than fiction? Answer, it depends on the fiction. I don't know how he would read those lines, but and then later he does something kind of similar with on page 90 at the very end. And here the poem's going to have to refer, okay, just that little move. And here the poem's going to have to refer to yet another fictional work. And it seems aware that he's been doing that all along, right? I mean, it's so that it's almost like an inside joke that you have with the poet. I had that thought earlier in this reading, and now he actually said it. Yeah. So it's this little intimate moment between the reader and the poet.
I liked that. That was the first of the poems that I sort of spent time with. And I jotted down, it's like chatting to Mike. Mike is my brother. He's a librarian and he's a music nerd and local history buff. And when you talk to him, that's the kind of thing that happens. He says, did you know such and such a street was called that? And then it reminds me, I met such and such a musician on that street. It's that type of thing that he throws all that stuff into the poem. And that endeared me to him just at the very beginning anyway. So I loved that poem. Yeah.
I found what I was looking for. It's in that King of Good Fellows. Of course it is. Why write at all if you're not giving away the store, tossing out your shiniest presents, bestowing your best boons, favors, benefactions?
Yeah.
Every time we write, we should be writing our best, to the best of our ability at that time. It's not always going to be great necessarily, but.
Yeah, this poem would have to be on my top 5 list, maybe. We can never really make these decisions, I don't think. But I love that particular poem. I loved it all the way from the beginning to the end. And I've already quoted from it in a couple of passages. But even the ending of it is really wonderful. I mean, it begins with Emerson and ends with Shakespeare. Like, okay. Makes sense to me.
Emerson and Plato.
Yeah.
It's a good lesson in when you write, letting your mind take you somewhere. Just what pops in your head and then see where it goes.
Well, isn't that, I mean, like in the way that music very often is improvisational. Couldn't it be that improvisational aspect of how the mind thinks? And if you follow it, of course, I teach William Stafford. He was always fond of quoting Blake. I give you the end of a golden thread, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built into Jerusalem's wall. And I think for him, if I remember correctly, he said, you could start with any thread, or just start with almost anything, and it would lead into some greater insight, or more than this. It would lead into something. I think Robert Bly asked him, he said, Bill, you get to Jerusalem every day? And he said, yeah, the suburbs are fine. Just as long as you get close. But, and more, some poems are a little bit more successful than others, as we all know. But kind of like we've already talked about within this book club, there is a presence of mind that we are always drawn to with a poet. We kind of take on their mind and see the world through their images or tones or references. And we do, the doors of perception. If the doors of perception were ever cleansed, we would see the world as it truly is, infinite. And our own perception of the world is expanded. And so, obviously for that reason, I'm always thrilled to read a poet, because they're going to expand what that perception can be.
Yeah. So in a very real way, he's introducing us to, more than this, more than what our world can see and be right now. He's expanding it.
Well, even in the notes, the very last word of the book is everywhere.
Yeah, Sandy, and more than what we're doing as writers, because I'm thinking about some of the poems I've written over the summer. Is like, have I pushed myself enough? Did I take that leap? You know, like the intellectual leaps that he takes. Did I take that risk in that poem, or is it a nice little controlled poem, little safe poem? I feel like he knows that he's taking risks.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Shakespeare said, I shall limit myself. You know, Shakespeare never said that in his life, right? I'm going to do it. And so he keeps going with his lines. So I may go back and look at some of my poems to see. Maybe this needs to be a more expansive poem. Where's the idea here? Follow the idea.
Yeah, on page 22, there's a little phrase where he says, his sense of the possible. And I think that's what you're kind of talking about, that, you know, even the poems we may work on, in what way can there be some larger possibilities for those? And maybe a poet like this one, you know, just kind of opens us up to that and reminds us that, you know, just as soon as I think, well, you know, my, you know, best poet friend, Will Mills, that died in 2011, I would see him do this. He would show me a poem, and I would be like you, Sandy. I'd say, okay, there's no way I could write this poem. Oh, wow. This is beyond. I mean, I read some people's poems and go, I could do that. I'd read a poem by Will and go, there's no way I could do that. And I'm thinking, this is finished. I'd send it out. And then he'd show it to me like 6 months later, and it would be on another level. Like, I would have been
happy.
Thrilled. I would have been thrilled with that other poem. And then now he's done something else with it, which was inconceivable to me. And it's just a good thing to think, even about our own work.
Which gets us back to that very beginning question here at the beginning of the hour, was what were his rough drafts like? You know, what did he start with? What were his raw materials here that got him started with one of these poems?
Yeah. I've got one of my little Post-it notes on I'm going to stomp your guts out. But my Post-it note just says research, quotations, connections. And there's something I forget what, I won't be able to bring this to mind myself, but when I teach creative writing, there's a little thing I use by Alice Munro, not a short story, but something that she wrote that was an explanation, but she talks about inspiration, or the found things that kind of come out of nowhere, that serendipity, these things that just land in your world. But there are 4 or 5 things that she mentions, and one of them is research. And I spend a little time in my classes talking about the ability. First of all, why would you not want to research? Aren't you curious?
Yeah.
Oh, you already know enough. Oh, my bad. I didn't realize that you're already content with the knowledge you have. No, research, it is another way to increase the possibilities. You never know what you might discover. You know.
Yeah, and then just being open to what the world provides you on a daily basis. You know, conversations, just you notice as you're walking through Walmart or the coffee shop or whatever. Like, the whole world is open for all of these ideas and these images, open for the taking.
Yeah. If the doors of perception are cleansed. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask KB to do something. Would you read the title poem, More Than This?
Sure. I can only hope it would be justice, do some justice to it. More than this. When you tell me that a woman is visiting the grave of her college friend and she's trying not to get irritated with the man in the red truck who keeps walking back and forth and dropping tools as he listens to a pro football game on the truck radio, which is much too loud, I start to feel as though I know where this story is going. So I say, stop, you're going to make me cry. How sad the world is. When young men died in the mud of Flanders, the headmaster called their brothers out of the classroom one by one. But when the older brothers began to die by the hundreds every day, they simply handed the child a note as he did his lessons. And of course, the boy wouldn't cry in front of the others, though at night, the halls were filled with the sound of schoolboys sobbing for the dead, young men only slightly older than themselves. Yet the world's beauty breaks our heart as well. The old cowboy is riding along and looks down at his dog and realizes she died a long time ago and that his horse did as well. And this makes him wonder if he is dead too. And as he is thinking this, he comes to a big shiny gate that opens onto a golden highway. And there's a man in a robe and white wings. And when the cowboy asks what this place is, the man tells him it's heaven and invites him in, though he says animals aren't allowed. So the cowboy keeps going till he comes to an old rusty gate with a road full of weeds and potholes on the other side and a guy on a tractor. And the guy wipes his brow and says, "You three must be thirsty. Come in and get a drink." And the cowboy says, "Okay, but what is this place?" And the guy says, "It's heaven." And the cowboy says, then what's that place down the road with the shiny gate and the golden highway?" And when the guy says, "Oh, well, that's hell," the cowboy says, "Doesn't it make you mad that they're pretending to be you?" And the guy on the tractor says, "No, we like it that they screen out the folks who desert their friends." You tell me your friend can't take it anymore. And she turns to confront the man who's making all the noise, to beg him to leave her alone with her grief. And that's when she sees that he's been putting up a Christmas tree on his son's grave, and that he's grieving too, but in his own way, one that is not better or worse than the woman's, just different, the kind of grief that says the world is so beautiful that it will give you no peace.
I love that poem, and I knew that you would read it so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the world is so beautiful, it will give you no peace.
Really like that comma. It allows him to double up on the meaning there. It's so beautiful that it will give you no peace, or it is so beautiful and it will give you no peace.
Yeah.
And that last line, though, is also sort of, there's an incarnation of that right in the middle of it. The world's beauty breaks our hearts as well. And then there it's in the last line in another incarnation there. The beauty, it's so beautiful, it will give you no peace.
Well, I think that's, unless someone has something else, that may be our perfect place to end.
Yeah, great conversation.
Yes, thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
December, we're going to meet on the 15th, and we're going to be discussing Mosaic of the Dark by Lisa Dordal, and she's going to come and talk to us for the last half hour of our meeting and answer questions. And so if you want to join us for that, the poet herself will join us.
Could you tell me that book again?
Mosaic of the Dark by Lisa Dordal, Dordal.
Helga, it's this.
Oh, Mosaic Dark. Okay.
Yeah, Mosaic of the Dark.
And show me the author.
It's
Lisa
Dordal.
Dordal. Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
all right. Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
You all also.
Bye.
Really enjoyed that, guys.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, David Kirby, for sitting down and writing poems.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Even long ones.
That must take a while. It probably takes him 15 minutes. Like, oh,
Don't depress me more.
yeah, probably.
Yeah,
writes
he'll
one of these.
Take him 15
Say,
minutes.
He's
free
inspired me.
Yeah.
Inspired my writing. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Good night, Kathleen.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, Sandy.
That was great.
Oh yeah, that was wonderful. It's a good. They're smart. They're smart people.
They are. They
Yeah.
are. Hey, I've been looking at books for next
Yeah.
year.
Okay.
You probably have too, but some ones that I think. Do you know this book?
I've seen it. I don't have it. But yeah, Victoria Chang.
Very, very interesting. It's obituaries.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Okay.
Really, really interesting. And we need to do Louise Gluck book, but I don't know which one. I mean, I have a couple. I just recently got this one, which won the National Award, but this is an old one.
Well, that's the one that's her most recent one. Well, there was one that came out. It's more of a new, a collected poems came out.
This
But
is
that's
2014.
She hasn't published another book since then, except a collected.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we do that one then.
Yeah, it's lovely. I also think another one that's really good is The Village.
I have that one.
I love it. I love that book. I really don't know how to talk about it, but that book also has some fascinating poems. Yeah, let's think about maybe that one, the Faithful and Virtuous Knot. That might be. I'm trying to think of. If people have not encountered her, what a good introduction is. Most people kind of really get into The Wild Iris. And I like it, but it's also, I like Ararat. That's an earlier book of hers. The Seven Ages probably is one of my favorites. I reread it quite often. There are poems in it that I love. One called Moonbeam, and something about something porch. But